Deciphering hair porosity. What is it? How do you determine what your hair porosity is? And how does it affect the products that you choose and use in your hair? Or does it? Those are the questions that I'm going to be answering in today's video. Hi, if you're new here, my name is Michelle. I am a licensed hairstylist with over 20 years of experience, and on this channel, I use those 20 years of experience to help you have healthy, happy hair. So first of all, let's talk about what porosity is. So porosity is the permeability of your hair. So how easily your hair lets molecules in and out of your hair is your porosity. The molecules we're usually talking about are water molecules, but not always. It can be the ingredients that are in your products and can also be hair color and other chemical processes that are used on the hair, like perms or relaxers or bleach, those things. These are the molecules we're talking about when we're talking about what can move in and out of your hair and how easily it can do that. And the way that your hair is structured, it has a protective outer layer called a cuticle, and the cuticle lays like shingles on a roof. So the shingles will lay kind of like this, and how open or closed they are helps to determine your porosity. Or in the case of bleach, which essentially acts like a stick of dynamite and will blow holes in your hair strands, you may have cuticle missing altogether. So if you have shingles that lay pretty flat, you're going to have less porous hair or low porosity hair. If you have shingles or cuticles that are lifted or pretty much blown out wide open, or like I said with bleach, completely missing, your hair is going to be high porosity. Now those are the two extremes, and you could have porosity that is anywhere between the two. In fact, you can even have more than one porosity on your head, depending on how long your hair is and whether or not you've had highlights and things that you've done with your hair. So for example, at the roots of your hair, you're gonna have your lowest porosity level up near the roots because it is the newest hair and it has not been subjected to shampooing, to styling products, to heat, to the air, the pollution, minerals in the water, or heat styling, any of that. It has not been subjected to as much of that as hair that's been hanging around for years, which is what it is when it starts getting this long, like what I have for my length. This hair has been hanging around for quite some time. It's been through some stuff, it's seen some things, and it's gonna have a higher porosity level than my roots. And if you have hair that is highlighted, then the strands that have been highlighted are going to be more porous than the non-highlighted strands. If you have like an ombre or bleach or whatever, everything that's at the bottom that's been lightened more is going to be more porous than the stuff as it moves up towards your head. Also, if you are growing out old highlights, and those ends are going to be more porous anyway because of what I just described with the longer your hair has been hanging around and the more that it's been subjected to, the more porous it's going to get. So you could very easily have multiple porosities all over your head. Now, how do you determine what your porosity is? There is the infamous cup test that's out there where you get some of your hair and you put it in a cup and you see if it floats or if it sinks or whatever it does. That is not an accurate way to determine your porosity. The way I do it is actually by feel. However, that is pretty difficult to teach, and it's something that I can do because I have done hair for so long that I can very easily tell what somebody's porosity is the second I run my hands through it. It's one of the reasons why hairdressers run their hands through people's hair, is so that because we can tell as much, if not sometimes more, by the feel of it than we can by looking at it, or the two will work in conjunction with each other to best determine what's going on with that person's hair. Now, there is a test that you can do using just a spray bottle and spraying some water in a mist onto your hair and seeing if it beads up or if it sinks in right away, or how your hair reacts. If it beads up and rolls off mostly before it actually starts to make the hair wet, chances are you have low porosity. If you spray your hair and it kind of sits there a minute and then starts to sink in, but doesn't do a whole lot of beating up and rolling off, your hair is probably somewhere in between. Now, if you spray the mist on your hair and your hair immediately sucks up all the moisture and it just soaks right into that hair, and sometimes what'll even happen too is hair in the surrounding areas will kind of bunch in towards that center. If that happens, you have a really porous hair. Your hair is really just trying to suck up all of that moisture that has been sprayed onto that hair. And I have definitely seen hair do this before. It's easier to do when you're not using a mist. Instead, if you set it on something like Squirt Fight. So yes, that's a technical term that a friend of mine and I invented in cosmetology school. Squirt Fight. So if you have it on Squirt Fight and you squirt your very bleached or damaged feeling hair, and you will see all of that hair kind of right in to where that moisture is, and that's a very good indicator that you have extremely high porosity hair. Although if you've bleached your hair, you already probably know that because you might have been told that, or you have figured it out along the way. Now, if you spray your hair and it doesn't beat up and roll right off, but it doesn't get sucked up immediately, it's somewhere in between, then you have porosity that is somewhere in between there. And some people might refer to this as medium porosity. I tend to not look at it as low porosity, medium, or high, because you can fall anywhere on the spectrum in between the high and the low. So you can have low, or you can have high, or you can have something in between, or you can have a little of everything depending on the length of your hair and things that you have done to your hair. So I don't really like to use just flat out medium porosity, because that makes it seem as if there's only 3 categories, and there isn't. There is a spectrum, and you can fall anywhere in that spectrum. And like I was saying earlier, you can have low porosity moving all the way into extremely high porosity on your ends, depending what you have done to your hair, how long it is, what it gets exposed to on a regular basis, which, by the way, sun can also damage your hair. If the sun has lightened your hair, it most definitely has made your hair more porous as well. So that is just one way that you can test and determine how porous your hair is. And like I was mentioning, all the different things that get done to your hair too, you can also use that in conjunction with that test to determine the porosity of your hair. So the less that you've done to your hair, the shorter it is. And some people are just born with more low porosity hair or higher porosity hair. You know, you can kind of figure it out by using both that method and by looking at kind of what you have done to your hair or not done to your hair, the length of it, and so forth. So finding out your porosity is a little bit of doing both, not just one test, but also taking a look at how you've cared for your hair, what you do with your hair, how often it gets exposed to sun or the elements, or air pollution if you live in an urban area, or minerals in hard water. All those things can kind of come together to help you determine what your porosity is. So once you have this information and you've determined your porosity, how do you then use it to apply towards purchasing products and using your products? And how much of a difference does porosity really make for purchasing products? Because if you listen to one person, they will tell you that your porosity is high on the list of things that you need to consider when purchasing products. Another person will say that it doesn't matter at all. I say that it does, but it doesn't, and it kind of depends on the product. Now, if you're talking about conditioners and hair treatments, your porosity means everything, because you need to treat what's going on in your hair. So if you have really high porosity hair because you've bleached it, because you've done something else to it, or it's naturally high porosity, then you're gonna want some treatments that help with whatever's going on. So your hair is likely gonna need moisture, but it's also gonna need strength and structure to kind of help fill in some of those gaps that may be missing because of how porous your hair is. So you can't forget about protein either. So that kind of informs that. If you have really low porosity hair, your hair tends to get built up a lot faster, like you get product build up on it easier. It's much easier to weigh down low porosity hair. Low porosity hair may not do as well with a lot of protein. It still needs protein. A lot of people will say that it doesn't need protein. That's not true. It still does. It's not protein sensitive because there is no such thing as protein sensitivity. It just means that you don't need as much, and it can be adjusted. And your porosity in your hair can change over time depending on what you do to it. So just because you start off with lower porosity hair and it doesn't need a lot of protein doesn't mean that you won't need more protein down the line. And if you're somewhere in between, that's usually the sweet spot. Typically, if your hair is overall pretty healthy, then your porosity really doesn't affect too much what you need to get for your hair. You just try a few things, see what your hair reacts best to, if it really likes protein more, or if it really likes moisture more, or it likes something that's just equally balanced and it has a little bit of both. You're gonna have to play around with that to determine, but you're pretty much in the sweet spot there with really healthy hair that isn't too porous or low porosity, because your hair probably isn't gonna get weighed down as easily. And then also with your hair not having the high porosity, you don't have to worry about treating it as often in order to help establish strength and structure and restoring that moisture into your hair, because your hair is overall pretty healthy. So you won't need to use treatments very often, and you can choose conditioners that make your hair feel nice and conditioned and behave the way that you like it to behave, make it more manageable, give it more slip for detangling, that kind of thing. So basically, porosity matters most when it comes to treating your hair and caring for your hair, more so than with styling products. Now, when choosing styling products for your hair, your porosity is really going to be more important if you fall on either end of the spectrum. So if you're way down in low porosity territory, or if you're way up in high porosity territory. So if you're somewhere in between in there and your hair is overall pretty healthy, feels pretty soft, pretty conditioned, doesn't feel dry, doesn't feel damaged, hasn't been damaged, that's when porosity is not going to come into play nearly as much. In fact, for that type of hair that sits somewhere in the mid ranges of porosity, is to pick out your styling products based more on your texture of hair, so fine versus coarse, and your hair's density. So whether it's high density, low density, somewhere in between. I would pick out products more for those than for your porosity, because you're somewhere in the middle, and that means that your hair is not likely to get as build-uppy or as weighed down as someone with low porosity, and then your hair isn't high porosity, so it's not damaged. It isn't going to need the strength, structure, and moisture that high porosity hair will. So find products that get you the results that you want, working with your texture and your density. Now, if you have low porosity hair, you're gonna wanna be careful with what you put on it, just because, like I said, low porosity hair gets built up a lot quicker than any other porosity. And if you have low porosity, low density, and very fine hair, then your hair gets weighed down the most of all. Like anything will weigh it down. So you're gonna wanna go with really, really lightweight products. You're also gonna wanna make sure that you are clarifying your hair regularly to keep the buildup off so that it doesn't continue to keep getting more and more weighed down. So low porosity is gonna really want to look out for the weight of products, especially if, like I said, your hair is also fine and low density. If your hair is coarser, low density, and low porosity, or coarse and high density and low porosity, you're not going to have to worry as much about your hair getting weighed down as if you have the fine hair, but you still are going to have to make sure that you keep clarifying your hair on a regular basis, because you still will have problems with buildup regardless of your hair's texture or density. So just because of the porosity, you're going to have to be concerned about that. Keep an eye out for buildup and clarify fairly regularly, probably more frequently than the other porosities will. And now if you find yourself on the high porosity end of the spectrum, Now, that is where styling products you pick out are going to want to have some additional benefit to your hair above and beyond what the conditioners you're using and the hair treatments you're using on your hair, just to help enhance and add to that and keep up with the health and the protein moisture balance in your hair. So even if you have fine hair, if you have higher porosity hair, your hair is not likely to get as weighed down as the person with low porosity fine hair will get weighed down, because your hair has got the higher porosity, and some of those gaps in your hair will get filled by some of the product. If it's got protein in there, it'll kind of fill in some of those gaps. The other reason why high porosity hair is not going to get weighed down nearly as easily is because the process of opening up those cuticles, so like when I showed you before, you've got the flat, and all those strands are going to sit flatter and smoother together, kind of like spoons in a drawer would sit. If they're facing the same way, the spoons are going to sit next to each other nice and tight. And so low porosity hair that is also fine tends to be really flat to your head because of that lower porosity, and because of the fineness of your hair, it makes your hair skinnier overall. It just doesn't look as full and voluminous because your hair is basically sitting against each other nice and tight, like some perfectly formed spoons right up against each other. Now, if your hair is high porosity, your hair is going to be blown out. You're going to have, raised cuticles, and they're not going to sit nice and flat. So when you've got this raised cuticles kind of sitting next to each other on different hair strands sitting next to each other, they're going to kind of hit each other a little bit more. Plus those blown out cuticles kind of increase the diameter of your hair, and it kind of fluffs it out a little bit more. It just doesn't lay very well together. It doesn't sit very well nicely together, nice and smooth and flat like it will with the low porosity. So that's why high porosity hair can handle a little bit more weight, because it's going to take a little bit to kind of calm that down. And in fact, you might actually need to help calm some of that down with a heavier weight product as well, to kind of smooth and seal your cuticle down so that it's not being blown out and, aggravating its neighbor and causing extra frizz. And that's part of what causes more frizz when your hair is more damaged and higher porosity, is because of the blown out cuticles. That, and your hair can break off during chemical processes, and does break off during chemical processes, especially with bleach. So then you have all these little shorter hairs, and that'll cause frizz as well. So when it comes to higher porosity, you can absolutely add more weight. You can handle more butters and oils because of the nature of high porosity hair. Even if your hair is on the fine side, you can start to handle some more of those heavy products. I still would not recommend really, really heavy products or using a lot of heavy products on finer hair, regardless of the porosity, but you could use a small amount of heavier products with fine hair that has high porosity and get good results for that. So that's when your porosity really matters most with picking out your styling products, is when you're on one very end of the spectrum or the other very end of the spectrum. Not nearly as much for the whole middle portion of the spectrum. And I still would, regardless of where you're at on the spectrum, the first things I would always focus on for choosing styling products, at least, is first of all, the results that you want to achieve. Second of all, what your hair texture is, so fine versus coarse, and then your density. So if you have high density or low density, and then choosing products accordingly to that. And then you can take into consideration where you sit on the porosity. If your hair, like I was telling you before, if your hair is low porosity, low density, and very fine, your hair gets much more easily weighed down than somebody who has fine hair, low density, and high porosity, because of just the way the cuticles are laying in that hair. That hair is going to be a little bit more voluminous and can handle a little bit more weight. So essentially, to answer the question of what does it mean for picking out your products, and is it absolutely everything or is it absolutely nothing? Well, it's neither one of those things. It's somewhere in between. It's just another factor to take into consideration when you are picking out your products for your hair. It means a lot more for treatments and conditioners. It means a little less for your stylers. And always, for stylers, I always say, figure out what you want for results first. Look at your texture and look at your density, and then look at your porosity and kind of make adjustments for all of those things combined, rather than solely picking things out for your porosity. I just don't see that working very well in the realm of styling products. And even with conditioners and treatments, you're still going to have to take into consideration some of the other factors in your hair, like whether it's fine or coarse, or if you have low density or high density, and how weighed down your hair gets, because it's still going to affect your hair. So you need to take all those into consideration. It's just porosity matters a little bit more for treatments and conditioners than it does for stylers. Now, where porosity really comes into play is chemical processes. So hairstylists, we have to learn a lot about porosity and how the porosity varies throughout the hair shaft, and we need to be very aware of that so that when we're coloring people's hair or bleaching it or doing any kind of chemical treatment on it, that we can adjust for those different porosities. We do that with perms. I remember when I was doing perms way back in the day when people were getting perms, we would equalize out the porosity before putting the perm in, so that we wouldn't over damage the ends and you would have a consistent curl from root to end. So that's where porosity mostly comes into play, is through that. And then, like I said, conditioners, treatments, and at the very last, styling products. So hopefully this video shined some light on porosity and how much it matters, and gave you some insight as to how to determine what your porosity is and what you can do about that knowledge and what you can do with that knowledge. So if you like this video, please go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. If you'd like to see more content like this, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell while you're at it. If there's anything that you'd like to see, any questions that you'd like to ask, or you'd just like to say hi, then please go ahead and leave a comment down below in my comment section. I love to chat. And as always, thank you for watching. Bye.